Thank you very much for attending this session. This is a topic that I think is certainly in everyone's mind in Greece in terms of inequalities. But my focus today is not necessarily going to be on Greece. I have obviously very distinguished colleagues who can talk about this in detail. But I wanted to give a view just based on recent evidence of how global inequality has evolved over the last decade and a half or so. And I want to leave, if I may, with a challenge, more of a thought experiment that I hope that my colleagues and all of you will try and engage in as to where it can go in the future, given what the future is going to look like. So let me begin on that. So my time is, apparently I don't have time on the clock yet, but I will start anyway and try to keep in time. So, what was the global income distribution like in 1988? So let me explain this rather complex graph to you. The colors, if you'd like, are the different countries or country groupings. Red, right on top is China, then India, and this is population weighted, right? So you see that's why China and India are so big. Other Asian countries, Latin America is green. There's a thin line of purple which clubs together both Eastern Europe and Central Asia, as well as the Middle East and North African countries. It's a very thin pink line that is Sub-Saharan Africa, and then the big blue bump are those, I call them developed countries. You can call them in different ways. That includes mostly North America, Western Europe, and Japan. Now, what does this graph show? The horizontal axis from left to right is from the poorest to the richest segment of the global population, right? This is the world population, and how people are distributed around it in terms of the number of people from various different groups at each level of population. It's a logarithmic scale, pardon me, so you begin with 100, 200, 500, 1,000, etc., but then rapidly go to 5,000, 10,000, 40,000, and so on. So what did it look like in 1988? What it looked like was that if you think of $1 a day, which is absolute poverty, that is a little bit, that's $365 a year. That is sort of just after the 200 mark. And a lot of the world's population was there, right? So you have almost a huge number of people, almost most of the population of India, a lot of the population of China, and then significant populations in other Asia, as well as some in Sub-Saharan Africa. The Western countries, the developed countries, were all on the right-hand side of the graph. Again, with a peak at that time around $10,000 per year. So that was 1988. So keep this image a bit fixed in your mind, and then see how it evolves over time. 1993, population is growing, but you can see that gradually it's shifting to the left, to the right, pardon me. And then, if you come closer and closer to the present date, and I'll stop very soon at 2011, which is the last data we have, this is how the world looked like. So look at China now. China, which used to be the red part, which used to be all the way to the left, to the poorer side, now has this big bulge that is really at the $1,000 per year sort of bulge there. India, which used to have most of its population below the poverty line, now is actually mostly above the $365 a day, right? And then you have the developed countries that hasn't moved very much, except at the outer margin. In the first graph, and I'll show you this in a second, it used to be 40,000 was the top limit. Now you have 60,000 the top limit, which is where the blue curve goes in. So the world has gotten richer. Everyone in the world, more or less, has gotten richer. Sub-Saharan Africa, which is the sort of light pink line, that is still one of the poorest parts of the world, as of course is India and parts of East Asia. Greece, I show as the range that Greece was in 2011. that was essentially the span of incomes that Greece had, between around 4,000 to around $20,000 per capita, poorest to richest, rough, give and take. So this is how global inequality has changed. So I'll talk about a few animals here. So I'll start with the snail. This looks like a bit like a snail, right? So that is how the world looked like in 1988, where you had a big shell, if you'd like, that was the world's population dominated by the Asian giants that were in the range of poverty or just above poverty. And then you had basically a big bulk of the population in the rich developed countries. Soon, that snail doesn't look like a snail anymore. Right? What it looked like is that the populations, while the Western countries, the developed countries' populations, have roughly the same amount of income overall, except at the very high end, where people have gotten quite rich at the high end. The other part, the shell of the snail, has moved and changed drastically. India, China, other Asian countries have really changed their shape. What you've seen, pardon me, is that there's been this huge increase in income of the middle class in China, and actually also, if you think about it, in Africa and in India. What you see is that the population of the Middle East, which was a thin line there because of the youth bulge, is actually growing tremendously and is actually on the right, and that's what's driving that purple line. And the upper deciles of the world population, which is dominated by the so-called developed countries, is more or less stagnant at the end. So this is where you come to another animal, and that is some of you may have seen this graph before. It's the so-called elephant graph by a very good friend of mine, Branko Milanovic, who used to be at the World Bank. What this shows is a translation of this pattern. What it shows is if you now take the people from the poorest to the richest in the world, what has happened to the change in their incomes between the time period here, 1998 to 2008. What you see is that at the very poorest end, incomes didn't go up that much. The poorest of the poor remained the poor. What you see at the other end, which is the trunk of the elephant, is that the richest populations, the richest 5% to 1%, had a massive increase in income. And then you see the back of the elephant, which is that the poorer countries, the countries in Asia and in other parts of the world that benefited from globalization, essentially the benefits of globalization that brought prosperity, jobs, global value chains to them, led by China, but also incorporating other Asian countries. Incomes of that population grew the most of all, even more than the richest. The most important thing, of course, and this is of relevance, and I'm sure my colleagues will pick it up, is what's happening in the global upper middle class, which is, of course, where the so-called developed countries' incomes raise. And the global upper middle class actually saw either no increase or actually a decrease in their incomes over this time period. That is the picture that we see here. And we should talk a bit about what happened, right? And what happened, and it's been analyzed now in scholarly articles all over the world, and so I won't try and summarize it here, but the bottom line is that this is indeed a story of what globalization and, which a point that I'll come to towards the end of my talk, automation has done. The back of the elephant is the unimaginable decrease in poverty that this world has seen. From millennia of poverty, there are now people who have grown out of this into a solid middle class. There's an upper middle class, as you saw in the China graph, the red, that you see. There's also a well-functioning lower middle class like you'll see in the India graph, right? Which is not as rich as China, but still well above poverty and with disposable incomes and growing fast. But now, again, look at those two snails, and you see that what has happened is that globalization has not given the income growth. And again, it's not absolute incomes, because absolute incomes are still good, right? You can see. But the income growth that Western countries in Europe, in North America, would have received. That is the story globally, and to look at it overall, and to put, again, if you like, Europe and Greece in the context of where things are. So I want to spend the last few minutes of my talk saying, all right, so this was the past. All of us are interested in the future, not in rehashing the past. There may be some historians among you, so I apologize to them. But for the rest of you, we're interested in what will happen in the future. So any sorts of policy, and we have policymakers here in the audience who are thinking about the future for Greece and for other countries. How do we actually make the right sort of policies for income, for jobs, for the world ahead? And that's where I want to look at what is going on in the world today, and that's what I call the 4 A's. There are 4 major trends that are defining what is going on in the world today. I call them automation, atomization, additive manufacturing, and of course, aging. These are the 4 big trends. And these will have the capacity of changing the shape of the graph that you saw, unless we are actually able to do the right policies for that. The policies of the past, and this is my thesis, and I'm happy to discuss this further, will not work for the 4A world of the future. Automation, all of you know. Essentially, there is today a change in the global production function. Those of you who are economists have grown up thinking about, and I did, I was taught the simple paradigm that, excess labor, cheap labor, and you do labor-intensive industries. If you have high capital concentrations, capital is cheap, you do capital-intensive industries, there's Ricardian trade and comparative advantage, and a globalized world, that is the foundation of a globalized world. But now with automation, capital is cheap compared to labor. A unit of production per capital costs vastly less. Anyone can buy the technology that is required for production. You don't have to live in a capital-rich country. So, could you give the example? Foxconn, who makes these things in China, employed 2 years ago 1.2 million workers in its factories. In 2 years from now, it will employ less than 10,000, and the rest will be robots in China. How about additive manufacturing? Now, I don't know if all of you are familiar with this concept. It's known by a much simpler phrase. It's called 3D printing. 3D printing, it's called additive manufacturing because the way that manufacturing process works is by adding layers rather than normal manufacturing which subtracts, right? You take a block and you carve out the machine part or whatever from it. Additive manufacturing changes the global chain because now you don't have to go, again, thinking of the iPhone, the screen is made in Korea, it's assembled in China, the design is in the US, the silicon parts come from Taiwan, and then there's a massive logistics chain that puts it all together in Shenzhen and then ships it to the Western world. You don't have to do it anymore because in 10 years, the machines are not ready yet, but in less than 10 years, maybe 8 from what I understand from industry, 3D printers will be sophisticated enough so that they can do all of that in the same machine in a place. And to change the design of the machine, all you do have to reprogram it. You don't have to build a new machine. Again, capital is not going to be a constraint. Atomization is on the other side. It's on the work side. Increasingly, most people, and there are some younger people here who are already in that group, don't have lifetime employment or a fixed employment like many of us do. I've worked for the World Bank for 20 years. No one does that anymore, and our children won't. They will not only work temporarily, but they will also often work in lots of different jobs that add up to a whole income and a whole livelihood, and be able to explore that. That is tremendously good for the poor of the world, because they then have much lower barriers of entry into self-employment than others. For the current well-off, this is not necessarily good, because we will lose the social protections and the other protections that are inherent in having a fixed full-time sort of work, because all of our regulations and social protections are linked to full-time work. And I am done with the last part, because I want to leave you there. Thank you, Yanis, for reminding me of this. Aging, and I don't need to spend any time on that, because the demographic change that is happening will also change the profile of work and incomes. In Greece today, pensions is a hot topic of debate. We know that everywhere in the world, pension systems, the traditional pension systems that are funded by existing workers are going to run out of steam, because there are just not enough workers in the labor force to pay for the pensions of the elderly in a fast-aging population, where you're likely to live as long in retirement as you're going to live in a work life. And so that is also going to change the way we work and how we work. So let me just then leave you with a question about what the graph, the elephant graph, may look like. What does that mean? This is pure speculation. The other stuff was empirical. This is made up. But I thought I'd speculate. It was interesting to try and do it. What it looks like is that automation will actually differentiate workers in all sorts of middle classes, in the rich world and in the poorer world, in terms of skills. That is what really defines it. And skills in terms of skills that cannot be automated, higher order cognitive skills, and we can talk about that in a second. Additive manufacturing, as I said, will shrink the global chain. You will actually see increasingly that there will not be a need to have these far-flung globalization, global value chains. It can be much closer to the centers of consumption. You'll see the atomization, I already spoke of social protections, and then aging lowest number of the rich world's population. So what it looks like, roughly, is it's going to be, my speculation, something like this. The rich, the very end of the population, is actually going to benefit the most. They'll, if you like, they'll own the robots. They'll own the mechanization. So, and even there, the higher order classes, because there are higher returns to these higher order cognitive skills, will also benefit over the next years. There's a similar dip, as you can see, in the lower middle class of the world, because the same sort of differentiation will happen there. So my speculation, and I'm sure my colleagues will quiz me on this or debate this, is that it's from an elephant, it's going to look more like a two-humped camel, if you like. And that is the world that, as we are changing that. I won't draw any further metaphors, but thank you very much for your attention.